I must have been, we're probably in Hawaii. And the chief came to me and said, "Look, your next assignment, I don't know how you did this, kid. You're going to be in Monterey for a year, Monterey, California, and you're going to go to Vietnamese language school. And here's your orders. When we get to San Diego, you're off the ship."
So then you go to Monterey and uh, you begin
Yeah.
language school, Vietnamese.
Yep.
Yeah. How many hours a day?
Well, 6 hours of classes and a couple hours of homework. It was intense. It was constant. It was just like going to college. It was run by the civilians. It was an army base that was administered by the army. But for example, I never saw. If I had a chief, I don't know. I never saw him or a commanding officer. The only people I ever dealt with were yeomen in the office. There was two yeomen in the office who would do your administrative stuff. As far as that, it was like going to college. You had a dorm room, with a shared bathroom. It was just like college, and you would just you'd show up. In some respects, it was like high school. You had a homeroom where you went first thing in the morning, and they would take attendance and any administrative stuff that they had to do, and then you go to your classes.
And how long did you do that?
36 weeks from the fall of '69, maybe September of '69 to like May or June of '70.
And then after that, do you go immediately back to South Vietnam?
No, I had after that I had leave, and then I came back. I went to SEER school. I went to weapons training at Camp Pendleton, and then after that I left.
When you're learning Vietnamese, were they emphasizing the South Vietnamese dialect?
Oh yeah, it was South. Yeah,
Yeah.
they did have a North, but it was a very much smaller class, and I think it was a little bit longer. It was like 45 weeks. But the South was. They had several South Vietnamese classes. They had shorter ones that were like 16 weeks or whatever, and then they had longer ones, and it was all Southern accent. It was Southern instructors. They were Southern Vietnamese instructors.
So you get through language school, you go to weapons training, you go to survival and evasion
Mhm.
training.
Yep.
So by the time you're at Camp Pendleton after language school and you're doing this weapons training, survival training, um, did you know what your next duty was going to be in South Vietnam?
No, you just go to Vietnam. You didn't know.
Wow. Um, so when did you find out what your next job was going to be?
Well, you get we flew on a commercial airliner. It was full of military people, but it was a commercial airliner with commercial stewardesses. They flew into Tan Air Field. Then they took you by bus to the Annapolis Hotel.
Right.
Those are the guys. And I don't know in what universe that's considered a hotel, but the Annapolis. I hear people say Annapolis Hotel, and I said, "Oh, gee, that was a dump." You
Yeah.
know. But anyway, we went to the Annapolis Hotel, and then from there, uh, in fact, it was kind of strange. We arrived one day and got all settled down, and the petty officer who was in charge says, "Oh, don't get too settled down because your guys are going to be going out probably the next day or two at the most." Well, first day goes by, a bunch of guys leave, and I'm still there. Second day, a bunch of guys leave, I'm still there. Get the third day, a bunch of guys leave, and I'm still there. And guys are coming in and coming out. And finally, I go to this petty officer and I says, I'm here 3 days, and how come I'm still here? And he says, I think they don't know what to do with you. He says they look at your record and you got all this Vietnamese training, and they have no idea what to do with you. So finally, on the fourth day, I end up going to Dong Tam, report to Dong Tam, and I get to Dong Tam. It's very obvious they don't know what to do with me. So when I was there, one of the first people I met was, in fact, it was in one of the pictures, Richardson, the second class gunner's mate, second class gunner's mate. And at that time, they were getting new ASPBs in the assault support patrol boats, and they were fitting them with these 3.5-inch rockets on the front 20 millimeter mount. And he says, "Well, if you got nothing to do, I need help." So for the first few weeks I was there, maybe 3, 4 weeks, I was helping him mount those tubes on the side of the mount, and then we would go out and sight them in. And the way we would sight them in, we either at that time of the year was kind of the beginning of the rainy season, so there's foliage getting in the clumps of foliage going down the river. But in lieu of that, if you didn't have that, you'd take something like a jug, like a bleach jug, or or something else that would float. You'd throw it in the river, you'd back up a little bit. He wanted so many yards, I guess, when they sighted him in, and then he'd fire it, and they would sight it in. It was actually a lot of fun because, a lot of times he would be out sighting it, to see where it landed, and I'd be the actual person firing it. It was actually a lot of fun.
You've been trained as a linguist, but your first few
Yep.
weeks in South Vietnam, um, you're doing this on the boats and testing these rockets and so on. So how long was it before started doing advisory work, or what after that?
So I think what triggered it was in at Dongtan, there were raids, river assault and interdiction divisions that were turned over to the Vietnamese, and they had advisors on the boat that would go out and be with the boat. And most of these guys didn't speak any Vietnamese; they would go out with them. And they had one incident where a guy was out on the boat and they got into a firefight, and I guess the Vietnamese didn't decide to shoot back; they all kind of hid, and he single-handedly got into the top 20 millimeter Mountain ASPB and suppressed that firefight and got them out of the area. And he came back and he was pissed. He was angry. And he said, I deserve a medal for this, for what I had to do. And I guess he talked to the chief and all that stuff. And they said, well, nobody was there to see. Of course, that was a big part of getting medals. Was nobody.
Right.
If somebody saw you, you could do something minor and get a medal. There were a lot of people who, excuse me, were obviously heroes that nobody ever saw what they did, and maybe they ended up dead. And of course, they got nothing. That's just an unfortunate part of Vietnam. So the chief says, well, this guy speaks Vietnamese. Let him talk to the Vietnamese crew and see what actually happened. And I interviewed the crew, and there was a yeoman there writing the stuff down. And I get, when that was over, I guess there was an executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Brown. He found out about this, how they got this information, and he came and talked to me, and he says, can you understand this? And I said, yeah, pretty much. He says, you know what? I have to go to a village meeting, to meet with a village chief, and because we as part of this act off turnover, why don't you come with me? And I want you, the guy's going to speak English with me, but there's going to be people there, and I'm sure they're going to talk Vietnamese. I want to know what those other people are saying, And we did that, and after that, I kind of became his go-to guy when he had to go to one of these meetings, right? And then after that, a lot of the turnover had been done, and during that time, they were building a lot of ATSBs, these advanced tactical support bases, and they were getting them built as quick as they could and turn them over. So they needed people for that kind of stuff, and they needed people to go on the boats with the Vietnamese. So then, when he didn't need me for these few meetings anymore, he started assigning me to go out with boat crews and stuff.
And you're going out with these boat crews primarily just to be on hand if you need to communicate in Vietnamese?
Yeah, or maybe call in air support, whatever. So the first place I went was up at the Cambodian border. The Benoit was a barrack ship that was kind of home to, at least when the Americans were there, they would barracks on the barrack ship, and and the barrack ship had pontoons tied to it, and the boats would be tied up. And so I would go out, and it was very loose. I mean, they would go. I would say he told me go up to the Benoit, go find some boats and go out with them, and help them out the best they can. I think the lieutenant commander who was there, Brown, he kind of figured this was a hopeless cause. You can see it in his face, but do the best you can and go out there.
Now, when this is a hopeless cause, meaning what? What was a hopeless cause?
Means we're going to turn this over, but this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. These guys don't have a chance.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. So, you tell the story of this guy who goes out, the boat comes under fire from Viet Cong, the Vietnamese guys, the South Vietnamese allies on the boat, they don't fire back. The one American suppresses the Viet Cong fire.
Yeah.
So what was your own perception? So, so we hear this story, what happened on the boat, then the officer says this. You said earlier in the discussion that your experience down in the Mekong, made you bitter. What you're seeing up in the the Tonkin Gulf, that makes you think we're winning, but now you're down in 4 Corps and your opinion of things has changed very much. And Vietnamization is very much underway. What was your own sense? Did you think that South Vietnam, based on what you were seeing, had any chance of standing on its own?
No. One of the things that happened when I was there, even before when we were lining up, when we were mounting the rockets, is that across from the 211, I was in ATF 211, which was the Amphibious Task Force 211, which was kind of formed after 117, which was the real Riverine Division, that Riverine Task Force. That was, I think, turned over in the end of '69. So there were remnants of those guys who became 211, some new guys that became 211, and it was kind of a hodgepodge of leftover, kind of leftovers advisors. They've all became advisors overnight. And one of the things that happened while I was there is that across the street, there was a little street in the base there in front of our compound, was the Vietnamese Army compound. So I figured one day I'll go over there and see if I can speak Vietnamese with these guys, you know. And after a couple of times being over there, you would have thought Elvis Presley was going over there when I came over because people kept crowding around. They wanted to talk to me and everything. In fact, I made one of the best friends I ever made. His name was Tao, Win Bun Tao. And he was a local guy. Most of those Vietnamese were from other places in the Delta. And in fact, they even brought their families. Their families were living on the base. I mean, they just weren't ready to have a fight. You know, they were showing up. They were living on the base, and their children were there on the base. You know, so but this guy was a local guy, and not far from Dongtown, there was I guess you could call it a city, Metaw. It was, any place that had a concrete building, I guess you call it kind of a town or a city as opposed to. And halfway between there, he had a house. It was a little single room uh, structure, all wooden. In one corner, there were mats. You could see where they slept. There was an overhang on the side of it. And on the outside is where they did the cooking outside the house. There was like a sterno type stove. I guess there was a lot of sterno back then.
Yeah.
And he invited me to his house 3 or 4 times for dinner. I became a really good friend. And in fact, when I would go over there, one of the things that they loved is I would bring a case of sea rations. And they had a small PX on Dongtown, and you had this ration card where you could get a certain amount of liquor per month, a certain amount of cigarettes. And he was a smoker, American cigarettes, and other stuff I could buy for him. So I would get that stuff, and you weren't supposed to do that, but I would bring it. And when I would show up, he had 2 kids. One was a little girl, probably about maybe 12 to 14 years old, maybe, and a boy a couple of years younger than that. And I would show up with these sea rats, and his wife would go through and take all the meat cans and then give the dessert cans to the kids. And sea rats had this little thing, a little excuse for a can opener. You had to kind of lever and open it up. And those kids would sit there. You thought it was Christmas time when I came. They would sit there and open those cans and be all excited when they got like a little piece of cake or crackers or something like that to eat.
What was it that led you to conclude when you were in the Delta that the South Vietnamese forces would not be able to hold South Vietnam?
Well, they had some very good South Vietnamese forces, like the Marines were very good. You see, the Navy was really neglected. I mean, if you look at the pictures I sent you, if you look at the Navy guys, they don't even have uniforms. They're wearing whatever they got, that they got on their own. And so they weren't really trained that well. They were just, you're out on a boat, here you go. I'm sure the Americans showed them, how to use it. But as far as like maintaining the boats and being trained. For example, those ASPBs had 1271 diesel engines. You had to be a good mechanic to take care of one of those. They weren't not simple engines to take care of. And these guys would get, how I don't know how much training, but it was not sufficient.
So you're not confident that the South Vietnamese are going to be able to hold, and you've referred
Yeah.
to, just habits of maintenance and training and being
Mm.
supplied and things like that. You said earlier that the experience made you bitter. What was it that made you bitter?
We just approached that whole thing wrong. We just did. We made when I think we made more enemy than we killed, or that we, pacified. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And the reason being is I think when we first went over there, and I wasn't there obviously when we first went over there, but you had Westmoreland who went there to fight a conventional war. And while that was part of it, that wasn't the important part. The important part was gaining the confidence of the Vietnamese people, not in Saigon, in the big cities, but especially the countryside, which was like 90% of the country. Because if you look at their history, foreigners were taking advantage of them since the French went in the 1800s or whatever. So they had no trust at all of foreigners. And of course, when Americans showed up, usually the outcome wasn't good, because they would, there'd be, if they went into a village and they thought that this was a Vietnamese village, they had no compunction about burning it down or taking prisoners and have them sent to Saigon where they'd be tortured, to get information out of them. And it just was, the Saigon government was terrible, as far as
Tortured by
oh
South
yeah,
Vietnamese.
by the South Vietnamese, yeah, South
Yeah,
Vietnamese intelligence,
yeah.
you know.
Now, when do you arrive in the Mekong then? It's 1970?
Yeah, summer of '70. I want to say the end of August, maybe.
So, so on the boats by that time, I mean, what's the composition of the force down there now? I mean,
All the boats that I were on were turned over. I don't think there were any American boats. They were all turned over to the Vietnamese. They're all flying South Vietnamese flags.
so you're on a boat, you're on boats flying South Vietnamese flags,
No.
and you're providing advice to them.
Yeah, the boats were also under the command of the South Vietnamese. So we had no say as to where we went, what we did. That was all came down from the South Vietnamese.
So what are you actually doing then as an advisor? I mean, so in your mind, put yourself on that boat and you're making your way down some part of the Mekong. What kinds of things are you
Well,
advising?
the one thing, we would do, first of all, from our instruction, from the lieutenant commander, was go out there and just try to help them the best you can. He had that kind of fatalistic that this is hopeless, but do the best you can. From the South Vietnamese perspective, they would go out on interdiction missions where they would sit in the middle of the river and just kind of like what our PBRs did, where they would go in and we're supposed to stop sampans and check, only they really never did that. In fact, I sent you some pictures that if you pay attention, it gives you, it really accurately describes what went on. That we went on patrol with a PBR, and you'll see the PBR going with us. And if you notice on the PBR, there's a Vietnamese guy laying across the ceramic armor on the front of the PBR, kind of stretched out, using it as a lounge. Well, that was a clear sign we weren't going to contact anybody. We were going to be in the middle of the river floating around. We weren't going to do anything that day. And that's kind of what and at
Well,
first I was kind of angry about that, but after a while, I really understood it because, you know, a lot of the Vietnamese were fatalistic about the war. I mean, the war had been going on forever, all their life, probably all their parents' life, and probably most of their grandparents' life. This country was at war, and there was no end. They probably believed it would never end. It was just a way of life, and that, why should I die for something that's kind of a useless cause?
and did you pick up that, as this turnover is underway and now these boats are manned by South Vietnamese, and as you're describing it, the South Vietnamese are not being very aggressive. They're not taking the initiative. They're not looking for a
Well,
fight.
they did for specific things that came down from the top. For example, when they went into Cambodia, they were still when we withdraw, they were still going into Cambodia, searching around for I guess Cosman at that time, where the headquarters was. They were still doing that. So they did do some missions, but for the most part, if left on their own to do a patrol like interdiction, where they had a territory that they were supposed to protect, or to patrol in, it was very very relaxed, not going to be aggressive.
Was it your sense at the time that the Viet Cong understood this, and so the Viet Cong are going to kind of leave them alone until the Americans pull out completely?
You know, it was a strange relationship between the VC and the South Vietnamese. It's not like, at least from my perspective, it's not like you hear most people describe, or most Americans describe. So, we talk about the VC, we think about this homogeneous kind of uniform organization is throughout the Delta, right? In my perspective, it wasn't like that at all. Vietnamese, like all people, are very tribal. Just like Americans are very tribal. My political party is better than yours. My neighborhood's better than yours. That kind of thing. Well, that was the same way with BC. They were all local people. Now they had a command structure, so if they had a major objective, then they would coordinate. But as far as like day-to-day tactical stuff, that was all the local whoever was in charge at the time. And and not all not and it wasn't really this homogeneous organization. For example, in the Delta, they had a sect, the Kaudai. They were like a country within a country. They had their own army, they had their own weapons, and they didn't like anybody. They despised the North Vietnamese. They tolerated the VC because they were locals. They
Hmm.
absolutely despised the North Vietnamese, and they had no use for the Americans.
This is
You know.
this small religious sect you're talking about, the Kaudai?
Yeah, it wasn't that small. I mean, they had their own army. They had their own weapons and everything. And see, here's where we went wrong. If we saw a weapon in a village, we assumed, okay, that's a Vietnamese village. Let's burn it down. Let's do something.
Mekong.
But those people lived in a lawless land. So if there was a battle and they could recover a weapon off the battlefield, they kept that weapon, and so they may not be hostile to you at all, but they had a weapon, and of course our army would go in and they saw a weapon. That's automatically assumed they're VC. When maybe they weren't. When
Yeah.
we got done, they were. When we got done with the village, they were VC.
Right. Yeah. So there's that problem, right? You don't know who's
Yeah.
friend or foe, and so then over
I
time,
can tell
it's
you
just that,
this: if
yeah.
you were to ask me what percentage of the people were VC, it depends how you define VC. If you're talking about actual combatants, it was a real small percent, probably something less than 10% of people were actually combatants, maybe less, maybe five, I don't know. But if you were to define VC as people in the Delta who had absolutely no use for the Saigon government, despised it, and didn't want Americans in their country, that was well over half. I would say 60, 70%. 60, 70%. And you could tell by talking to them, you know,
Yeah.
they, once they found out you could speak Vietnamese, that made a big difference. But as far as like Americans in general, particularly the American military, the outcome was always bad when the military showed up. So they had no use for us. They wanted us out.
When you were with these South Vietnamese forces on these boats,
Mhm.
did you get into combat situations?
Yeah, we did. We got fired at, and we fire back, and most of the time get out of the area, call in. What I would do is I try to call in like OV-10s because they OV-10 was an attack airplane, ground attack airplane, or helicopter or whatever, and let them handle it.
Now the air
Much
power,
the same tactic as the PBRs did. PBRs, they really weren't supposed to engage in a heavy fight when they were out there because they weren't designed for that. They were designed for inspecting sampans and things. So if you got into a contact, you wanted to call in support, and that's what we did.
and at this time, air support was still primarily
Oh
American.
yeah, yeah. Air support was excellent. It was really good.
What's the most memorable mission as you're doing this? Now, if I remember correctly, about 4 months into your time in the Delta is when you're wounded, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
before that time, before you're wounded, what's if is there a particular event or mission that is kind of most memorable for you or that especially stands out in your memory?
Well, there's missions, and then there's things I did that, in retrospect, were really stupid. So we were. I was with a boat crew who was local to the Delta, and we were out of Dongtan, and our they were doing interdiction from Dongtan down the river, a little past Metol, right? Once you get past Metol, you're getting into Ben Tre, which was not a good area to be in, unless you it was a very hostile. It was never what we consider pacified. It was never, even to the end of the war, it was not pacified. It was always dangerous. So we're out there drifting, and we had done it overnight. It was getting to be morning, and I was talking to the boat captain, and we were just sitting there drifting down the middle of the river. We go up the river to where Dongtan is, and we drift down with the river. And we were past Metog, getting into the Bentre area, and I says to him, I got to get going back. Besides, I want to get back to Dongtam. I need a haircut. And I was telling him how bad the haircuts were in Dongtam because I think Navy didn't have a rating for barber. Whoever they signed was you got horrible haircuts. And he says, "No, you can get a haircut here. I know people. I live here. I says, "You sure?" I says, "Yeah." So he takes us up this canal, which automatically makes me kind of nervous. And in the mornings in Vietnam, from like dawn to like 10 or 11, there was always local markets. And they're always like by the water. And this is where they sold like rice and produce, and people got together.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was good about them is they always had a coffee cart. It was the Vietnamese coffee cart. They'd have some home woman set up, and they'd have a steel container with like sterno heating up the water. And they'd have the little French things where they drip the coffee. And I would just tell them to, give me double water, milk up high. You give me double water so that I could, because that coffee was like really strong. So we go in and we get this coffee, and he says, "Here, there's this barber's over here. He's really good. He'll cut your hair." So, and they're going to stay in the market because they're looking around, they're buying stuff to eat. So he says, "Go to that building," and sure enough, there's a little tiny painted barber pole. You could tell it was hand painted, and there was no door; it was just an opening. And I go in there, and the guy looks around. The guy's probably about 40, 45, 50, and you could see in his face immediately that he hated me. He was probably thinking, "Where's my AK? I want to kill this son of a bitch." You could tell right away. And I finally said in Vietnamese, the guy, boat captain sent me. And he says, "Boat captain." And I mentioned his name. And then he got kind of suspicious. And he he walks out the door and he sees the boat captain in this little market. And he says, "All right, come on in." And he's, I need a haircut. How much is it and all that stuff? And the only thing I had with me was a 45. I left this M16 on the boat, which I thought was a big mistake. No. So we sit down and he's not saying anything, and I'm trying to make small talk, and he's just terse answers. He doesn't want to talk to me. You can tell he hated me. He just hated me. And finally we're talking, and as we're getting to talk, he asked me, first he asked me if I was American, where I was from in America, how long I was in Vietnam, and did I see any VC? He was probably the VC leader in the village.
Yeah.
And after a while, we started talking, and I started getting this lecture about how much damage and destruction and misery the Americans have caused in Vietnam. And I got this lecture while we are getting his haircut. And this guy's got his razor hanging about my neck, and he's telling me how horrible Americans are. And by the end of it, I think he was kind of softened up a little bit. But he, given the opportunity, I think if he saw me again, he'd shoot me. That was that kind of experience. So it was kind of stupid on my part to believe this boat captain that, I live here. I know all the people. Right. Well, obviously this guy was a VC. The boat captain was going for this, but they were getting along. They didn't care. They weren't trying to kill each other. It's just strange, very strange. When you went into a village, whether they were, just by the body language and the language, and you hear them talking, American, you can tell in Vietnamese, we got to tell this person, got to tell that person,
Nine May, yeah. How's the haircut?
Actually, it was pretty good. The guy was pretty good. Yeah. They must have been a real barber, Yeah. But at nighttime, I'm sure he was out there, where he commanded it. He's probably like a local commander, to be in a village during the day like that. He's probably a local commander. In that village, like many villages, there were no military age males. All there was little kids and women and older people, and he was like the only, and he was probably 40, 50 years old. But no, so they either got drafted by the South Vietnamese or they went into become VC. Which, by the way, nobody out there called them VC. The only people called them VC were the Saigon government and the military when they talked to Americans. But they were Lin Yai Phong. They were liberation troops. When you got 20 miles out of a city, they were liberation troops. They weren't VC.
What happened when you were wounded?
So the first time, this is up near Rak Ya, which is in the Kinh Yang province, which is on the western side. They were building the CVs were building an ATS, advanced support tactical bases. And there's a job I would not want, being a CV, because they would go to an area, they would start clearing an area out, And imagine the first few days were pretty scary because nothing was there. They were living in tents. They had their equipment that was dropped off by these LCM8s that would drop them off, and they were their own defense. They probably have boats and people would know there to protect them, but that was a scary job. I wouldn't want that job. But
Yeah.
anyway, they had built this base and they had put up lights and had a generator and they were still starting to put up the buildings. And they had a diesel generator for the lights, and they had perimeter lights that were lit all night. And I guess they had Vietnamese employees from the local village there who would come in and help them and do kind of grunt work for them. And one afternoon, they went to fill up the generator, and they had a single pump. They had a tank that was a raised tank with the diesel fuel in it, and then they had a 50-gallon drum on a cart, and they would drain the diesel fuel into the 50-gallon cart. They bring the cart over to the generator, and the head would look like a well pump that went on the 50-gallon drum, and they'd pump it into the generator. Well, the pump was gone. It was the only pump they had, and the generator was low on fuel. So that night they could have been out of electricity in the dark, and that was a sign. I guess they were concerned that, well, somebody's setting us up to be attacked. So they needed somebody to run the rakia, a boat to go to rakia and get a pump and bring it back. And that's what we did. We brought this thing, and we were. I gave them the pump. They started pumping in. They still had lights and everything, and the mortar started coming in. So I ran. First things guys run back to the boat. The Vietnamese were still on the boat, and in fact they were starting to pull away. So I'm running down there, and I thought I bumped something. It was dark; you couldn't see very well, and I thought I bumped something, and I just kept going. And they brought the boat in. They had built a little pier, and I had jumped on the boat, and I did a front 20-millimeter mount. They had started backing up again, and I said, grab the front millimeter mount. I noticed like blood's coming up like this, and I figured, well, I bumped something. So they got it like that, put a bandage on it, and I wrapped it up, and didn't think much about it. So we had to go back to Dongtam because that boat was having some problems. One of the engines surging. We went back to Dongtam, which took a day and a half to do that. And I went to the infirmary and said, "Hey, I bumped something here." And the corpsman said, "No, that you didn't bump nothing there. There's a clean crease. You got grazed by something, a bullet or something." And I said, "Yeah, really?" And in fact, I still got the scar here to this day from that.
Wow.
And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I'm going to put you in for a Purple Heart. You got wounded." Well, that's how that happened. It was strange.
And then how long was it till you were back on duty?
Oh, that was never off duty. I had a bandage. That was it.
Just a bandage.
After a while, I took the bandage off. In fact, I think they had stitches, and I remember the guy pulling them out. He's now on stitches. I had to go back, and that was more painful. That was the painful part, is taking those stupid stitches out. That hurt. But
And then was it the second time you were wounded? That was a much more serious thing.
yeah, that was much more serious. That was another ATSB, Keenan, and that was up near the Uman Forest. And it was it was being turned over to the Vietnamese. And in fact, the lieutenant commander was on that base that day, and there was probably 20 or 30 Navy people from all different works of places that were dumped into 211. So,
Yeah.
for example, they had a base called Sea Float, which was a bunch of pontoons put together, and I guess they had turned that over. So those guys came up. So there were like 20 or 30 people there. They were kind of finishing the base, building sandbags and around the buildings and stuff like that. And we got into a mortar attack, a couple over a period of several days. And then there was this one pretty intense mortar attack, and the Vietnamese barracks, they had separate barracks, a separate mess hall, separate everything from the base. The base was the Americans had temporary stuff because it was going to be turned over to the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese had the permanent buildings. And when the mortar hit this barracks building, which was a metal building, it was a sheet metal building, the shrapnel went and wounded a lot of people. So the corpsman had to go out there, and there was a lieutenant colonel who was an advisor for defense. He went out there, and I had to go out there because the corpsman needed to speak to the Vietnamese to tell them, that we're here to help them or anything like that. And we were out there patching the Vietnamese up, and we were on our way back because they had some minor wounds. And there was a guy, Bob Young, who was a second-class engineman. He was with me because he had volunteered to go out, and something hit. It was either a grenade or a mortar or something. I don't know what it was. And that's when I got seriously wounded. Robert Young died. Robert Earl Young from Florida. I remember him. He died that day. And the corpsman was seriously wounded, and the lieutenant colonel was wounded too. So they medevaced all of us sometime that night.
What was your wound?
Shrapnel all over. I had a flak jacket and a helmet on, and if it wasn't for that, I probably may not be here. Because I had arms and legs, and but not fortunately nothing in the head and nothing in my torso.
So I kind of want to walk through this process then. So there you are. What do you remember about the process of being medevaced?
So I remember the helicopter came in, and I was on a stretcher, and they had already put Bob Young in there because he was already in there, and they actually threw me in the helicopter. They were worried that the helicopter was going to get hit, and it eventually did get hit. They threw me in, and I landed on top of him, and he was startled. I said, "Don't worry, we're going to be okay," not knowing that he was going to later die. And the helicopter took off. And then I don't remember much after that, but I did hear after the fact from the pilot, because I saw the pilot at the surgical hospital, because he came around to see what happened to the guys he brought in, that helicopter did get hit, and it was leaking fuel, and they had to stop someplace and refuel. And I guess they have stuff they can put on the bladder to seal it up. And they did that as temporary. And then they took us to the 3rd Surgical Hospital in Kanto. And that's where I was there for a month. And then I was medevac to Japan. And I stayed there I was there over Christmas. And then I was on I guess it was those big cargo planes, the C-130s, in a stretcher, and came back and went this the Naval Hospital on Treasure Island. Okay, so it was the Oakland Navy Hospital, I guess.
And how long was it before you were released from the hospital completely?
I wasn't released until, let's say, June, the end of May and June. But I wasn't confined to the hospital. I was confined to the hospital for another, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 weeks. And once I I had a lot of trouble walking because my muscles had tightened up and I couldn't straighten my legs out. So I would go to, I was considered like an outpatient. All right. I would sleep in the hospital, but then I have therapy in the morning, therapy in the noon, and therapy in the afternoon, physical therapy. But in between there, I could go out of the hospital and try to walk. In fact, they encourage you to try to walk around, you know. In fact, toward the end, they actually gave me a job to do. They gave me a golf cart and a radio, and I would ride around Treasure Island, and I guess sort of like security, but it was never really security. It was, doing odds and ends. Like I remember they had Navy housing there, and one of the officers' wives came out and saw they had a flat tire, so I went over there and changed the flat tire. That was the kind of stuff I did.
Mm. Of all the wounds you had from the shrapnel, what was the most significant one?
My legs.
Your legs.
My legs were.
Now, was there any concern? You mentioned Bob Young, and so initially he's wounded, but then he passes away. Was there any concern at the outset about whether you'd make it or not, or was it clear that you would make it? You just needed to get patched up?
No, I didn't think I would make it. I always thought I would make it. I remember when we went to the surgical hospital. We were dropped at the surgical hospital. People came out and took us off in stretchers, and then they put us down. It looked like, I don't remember exactly, but I remember seeing like a garage door type thing, a metal door, and there were 50-gallon drums all over the place. And they put us down between the two 50-gallon drums, and a nurse came out, I guess to do like kind of triage. And she pointed to Bob and said, "We got to take him. He's worse." And I laid there and I fell asleep. Well, I was sit there I was on the floor, and I remember just going to sleep. And then when I woke up, I already had been operated on. I already had stitches and all kinds of stuff, and I don't remember anything between that.
And when were you wounded? Yeah, was it November 70?
No, well, November 29th, it was the night of November 29th. or
November
maybe
5th.
the 30th. It was probably after midnight.
So late November, and then how long is it until you're able to get around under your own power? A little bit?
February, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a gradual thing. You walk a few steps and you'd have to rest.
And where were you at Christmas time?
In Japan, Tokyo, in the Naval Hospital in Tokyo.
Do you have any particular memories of that Christmas when you're in Tokyo
Yeah,
in the
it
hospital?
was deserted. We were in a ward. I was in there with probably 5 or 6 other guys in this large room, and I think probably most of the staff had Christmas off because you couldn't find anybody. You know, there was an orderly who brought you your meals, and that was it. They didn't see anybody else. At least maybe they were there, but I didn't see them.
Was there any attempt that you can remember to bring a little Christmas cheer to the guys recovering
No,
from the wounds?
no, it was gray hospital walls. That was it.